And now, CL 650 presents your source for leading-edge news and information on today's hottest products and services. This is Experts on Call.
Well, welcome this evening, and my name is Tony Gioventu. I'm the host of Quay Pacific's Talk About Strata. We use the show to talk about current events and what's happening with strata corporations and what's happening within our communities, new legislation, construction, pretty much everything that affects your strata corporation. We're really fortunate tonight to have in the studio Veronica Franco, a lawyer from Clark Wilson, who provides service and education and public resource to strata corporations and managers across the province. Welcome, Veronica.
Thanks for having me.
It's always a pleasure. And Shannon Salter, who is the appointed chair of the Civil Resolution Tribunal, and a lot of people have now started to talk about and hear about the Civil Resolution Tribunal and its implementation in the coming year and what it's going to have for an impact for strata disputes, but more than that. So welcome to the show, Shannon.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. Tell us a bit about the tribunal and kind of the basic concepts of what the tribunal means.
Okay, so the tribunal, when it opens next year, as you said, will be Canada's first online tribunal, and it will be able to resolve small claims matters under $25,000. So those are matters that currently go to the small claims court, and people will have the choice to bring that to the Civil Resolution Tribunal or the CRT instead. It will also, though, and more relevantly for your listeners, be able to handle and resolve most strata property disputes. So disputes that some of those disputes go to the small claims court right now, but many of them have to go to the BC Supreme Court, and those will be able to come to the CRT instead. The tribunal, as I mentioned, will operate primarily online, which means that people will be able to resolve their disputes wherever they happen to be, from a mobile phone or a personal computer, at a time that works for them and fits into their lives. So after work, after the kids are in bed, they can fit it around really their reality. And this is a pretty transformational approach to justice. The idea that instead of making people fit in to the existing justice system, a system that they're often unfamiliar with and is very confusing for them, we're trying to redesign this little corner of the justice system so that it works for people's real lives, so that we come to them. And doing it online or having the ability for people to use technology is one of the ways that we're going to them. The other way we're going to them is by giving them a choice of how they can resolve their problem. So when you go to court, there's one choice. A judge decides your dispute, and then if you're lucky to be in some registries, you might get some mediation as well. What the CRT will do differently is provide people with a whole suite of dispute resolution mechanisms. So people will be able to first on their own diagnose their problem using a solution explorer, which is sort of a series of guided questions and answers. And Tony, you've been very involved with helping to develop that on the Strata side. So that'll be free for everybody. But then within the CRT, people will be able to negotiate or use the facilitation services from the CRT, and they'll have a dedicated facilitator who will work with them and the other party to reach a consensual agreement. And then if that fails, they still have a binding decision available to them through adjudication. And the decisions of the tribunal are binding on the parties, and they can be enforced as a court order.
So this is kind of like technology transformation of the justice system. So we went to 24-hour banking with bank machines, and essentially we're kind of going to 24-hour justice.
Well, that's it. Again, people are used to conducting their affairs at a time that's convenient for them, using technology. And it's not that technology is the be-all and end-all. I don't worship at the foot of my computer, but I think it has real potential in the justice sector because of the flexibility that it offers and the fact that it's accessible by and large. So 93% of British Columbians have access to high-speed internet. 93% of people between 19 and 34 have a smartphone that they use to communicate, not just as a phone. So this is a way to actually bring the justice system to where people are. Unfortunately, 93% of people don't live right next door to a courthouse.
Right. So it's pretty revolutionary change in how we look at justice as well then.
It is, and I think that can be exciting. It also has challenges and opportunities, and I know people sometimes wonder, well, what about that person you know in your life who might not be comfortable with technology, who might be unwilling or just unable to use it. And our philosophy, and consistent with increasing access to justice, is that you don't leave anyone behind. So we're still able to offer the tribunal services through telephone or paper if necessary. But we're giving the majority of people who are comfortable with technology the opportunity to run ahead and to resolve their disputes very affordably and quickly, really on their own terms.
So if you're in Fort St. James and you still have dial-up, the tribunal is probably going to not function that well for you, but you still have the ability to use traditional methods of communication through the tribunal system.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So that works in everybody's benefit. What about time and cost?
Well, in terms of cost, it will be similar in cost to the fees that are currently charged by the small claims court. So all told, that's about $200 or so once you add in incidental fees. It'll be similar. But the fees will be staged. So if you're able to resolve your dispute at the facilitation phase and you don't need to go to adjudication, you'll pay less than somebody who has to use the full suite of the tribunal. I should also mention that there will be fee exemptions for people who would incur financial hardship by paying the fees. This is a special, or it's especially advantageous for strata disputants who would otherwise have to go to the Supreme Court, because we know that court fees there and legal fees there are very high. They're considerably more than $200.
Right.
In terms of time, our goal is to resolve disputes within 60 days. That won't happen all the time, but for most cases, we're hoping to do that within 60 days. By contrast, the current small claims time to trial is between 12 and 18 months, and we know that that's longer at the BC Supreme Court for some strata issues.
Right, right. So, and that's one of the things that we face, Veronica, from your perspective, with a strata corporation where you have an individual who is violating bylaws, and beyond fines, the next step is an order through the Supreme Court for them to comply with the bylaws, and that can take a very long period of time.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I was just thinking about today. I got an email at my office, and a strata corporation, was talking about wanting to do repairs to a common property attic, and the owner wasn't providing access. The advice that normally I would give is, well, you give notice pursuant to the bylaws, but if the owner still refuses to provide access, your only remedy is to go get a court injunction. So obviously the next question is, how much is that going to cost, and what's the timeline? The timeline can be fairly quickly because you would just do it by petition. So
Right.
you could probably do that within a few weeks, depending on how much of an emergency it is. But the cost is going to be over $10,000.
Right.
And they have to raise the money to do that. And so that's going to take 20 days to raise the money to go and do a notice to raise the funds to do the litigation. And there's a good chance that owners, unless it's affecting them directly, aren't going to vote in favor of this levy to do this litigation, because it's just too much money.
Well, and it could legitimately be a $10,000 to $15,000 cost that's associated with the need to inspect an area that may have no repairs or only a $500
That's right.
repair, and you've spent $10,000 to deal with a $500 element. That just makes absolutely no sense whatsoever.
Yep.
Yeah.
And oftentimes those disputes arise because there's a misunderstanding between what the owner thinks their obligations and the strata corporation's obligations are, or there sometimes is some other underlying issue that you just don't get at when you're going full steam ahead through litigation. But whereas if you're doing some kind of facilitation, exploration of the issues, you might get to certain issues that would not easily become apparent until you've spent a lot of money.
So I think, Shannon, that for strata corporations, the big question is going to be, so does that mean if an owner isn't complying with bylaws, will we be able to go to the tribunal and eventually, through the decision-making process, get an order for this owner to comply with the bylaws, which may result in other court enforcement further down? And I think that's what really listeners, and I think that's what strata corporations are probably most interested in.
Yeah, and absolutely that's the case. The Civil Resolution Tribunal Act, which has been passed, gives the CRT pretty broad jurisdiction to resolve disputes that deal with governance issues and the enforcement of bylaws, the enforcement and collection of fines. Now, the caveat is that initially, anyway, the CRT will be voluntary for owners.
Right.
So it will be mandatory for strata corporations, but it will be voluntary for owners and tenants, and frankly, also for other parties on the small claims side. there is likely that there will be legislation introduced to change that and make it mandatory for everyone. But initially, it is voluntary for those entities, so strata owners and tenants. But if a strata owner and tenant agrees to have their matter resolved by the tribunal, then yes, the tribunal can, if they agree with the strata corporation, order an owner or tenant to pay or to refrain from doing something or to do something. And in that way, it will be, I think, pretty effective at enforcing bylaws.
So here's a message for listeners and strata corporations. Email your MLA and tell them how important you think it is that it is mandatory, so that all the parties are involved and that it's a level playing field. Because for strata corporations, it's unfortunate the number of court disputes we've seen where there literally have been hundreds of thousands of dollars spent over issues that should never have occurred, and where that money would have been best served protecting their properties and their interests.
And in that sense, too, I think the CRT is really in line with the communal living that is the best part of stratas.
Right.
That you have this neighborhood relationship, but it relies on people respecting each other and respecting the rules. And if you don't have an effective means of enforcing those rules, then it really detracts from that. But I think your point is, you made a good point too about early resolution. If you're able to tackle these issues sooner rather than later, you have a hope of preserving these relationships that will continue, for better or for worse, throughout the dispute and after the dispute. And you don't want that ending up in court many tens of thousands and months later.
Well, I think that, early resolution, I think that one of the things that we've all realized over the years of dealing with strata is that no matter what happens after the dispute, you still have to live together.
That's right.
You don't get this divorce unless one of you sells and moves away, which is frequently not that possible because of a protracted dispute that's gone on for so long. So, it's one of the implications. We have an email. I've gone through our hundreds of emails that we've got and just kind of ciphered out some of them that actually help us to understand how the applications work under the current system, how they would work under a tribunal system, and how the relationships will change as we go through this. And so let's go through some of those. And Veronica, you can give us all of your best legal sense on what the strata should be doing. So the first email is from Karen, and it deals with a strata that has a bylaw that prohibits the number of pets to 1 cat and 1 dog, and they have an owner who's moved in with 3 dogs. So the seller said that to the buyer that no one enforces the bylaw because several people have more than 1 dog, and the buyer wouldn't have to worry about it. So the new owner moves in, tells the strata the same information, and says that they're not really worried about the bylaw. They're not going to comply with it. They have an old dog that's not going to be around much longer. And so they basically say, we're not going to comply with the bylaw. You'll have to fine us, take us to court, whatever you're going to have to do, because it doesn't look like anybody else is complying with the bylaw. So Veronica, you get the phone call from the strata and says, so how are we going to deal with this?
Well, the first thing I would say is let them know that just because other people have more than 1 pet does not mean that they can't enforce the bylaws. There may very well be exemptions granted, grandfathered pets, etc. So that isn't the fact that there are other people with more than the limit of dogs doesn't preclude the Strata Corporation from enforcing the bylaws. And in fact, the Strata Corporation is required to enforce the bylaws, so they need to start taking steps to do that. And the first step in any kind of bylaw enforcement is to essentially go through the procedures that would allow them to take enforcement. And under the Strata Property Act, that includes fines, remedying a bylaw contravention, and the third one I won't get into because it has to do with recreational facilities, and that has nothing to do with this particular scenario. So generally speaking, when you're dealing with this kind of a pet issue, you generally start with fines because that's the easiest way to try to enforce the bylaws. To levy a fine, you have to send a letter to the owner giving them notice of the particulars of the complaint. So letting them know that they've been observed with more than the 1 pet that's permitted, the date and the time that they've been observed, for example. And then they would have to tell them what bylaw that would be in contravention in, and they would also have to let them know what the potential penalty may be. Then the letter should also address how much time the owner has to respond to the allegations and whether they agree they should be fined or not in the event they are found in violation of the bylaws. Then the Strata Corporation has to allow the requisite time they've provided in the letter to pass for that owner to respond. And if the owner, after that time has passed, and taking into account whatever the owner has provided, including a hearing if they've requested one, consider all of the circumstances and determine whether A, there has been a violation of the bylaws, and B, what the penalty should be, what the fine should be. Then the Strata Council makes that decision and sends a letter finally to the owner saying, we've met, we've discussed, we've considered everything that you've told us, and we find you in violation of the bylaws, and we think the fine should be X. Let's say it's a maximum $200 fine that they have in their bylaws. They're going to fine $200, and because this is a continuing contravention that goes on and on and on until that pet leaves the unit, they can fine, assuming it's in the bylaws, every 7 days. So the Strata Corporation now, if they've gone through that procedure, are able to fine $200 every 7 days for as long as these pets remain in the unit. Now, we have court examples that provide where owners don't care so much about the fines, and they're willing to pay the fines in order to get away with whatever behavior they have that they're undertaking. So in this particular case, if you have a dog owner who says, I love my pet, it's worth paying $200 a week to keep my pet here, the Strata Corporation has essentially failed in enforcing the bylaws. So by failing to enforce the bylaws, the Strata Corporation now has to decide what they're going to do about it. And the courts have said simply fining forever and ever and a day is not enforcement of bylaws. At some point in time, the Strata Corporation has to take additional steps for bylaw enforcement. And that would mean going to court and getting an order, an injunction to have the pets removed. And then we're again looking at going to Supreme Court by way of petition, and probably spending tens of thousands of dollars on this kind of a case.
Well, so daunting for the Strata Corporation.
Absolutely.
Right? And it's difficult for, because of the structure of the court system and the jurisdiction that they have to go through, if the owners actually voted in favor of enforcement of the bylaw, because it's a Supreme Court action,
That's correct.
then the Strata Corporation is going to be in a financial situation that's going to be costly for enforcement. We're going to take a short station break, because I see our producer waving at me saying that we need to take a short break. And we'll come back, and Shannon will talk about what the steps are, what's going to happen with the tribunal, because it's if the tribunal is not mandatory right away, and yet an owner can actually file a complaint against the Strata that makes it mandatory for them to enforce the bylaws, the Strata would be have no choice but to be forced to go into Supreme Court action. So it kind of creates a little bit of a three-way triangle of a little bit of a problem. So I'm Tony Giventu, host of Quay Pacific's Talk About Strata on 650 Sea Isle.
This is Experts on Call on Sea Isle 650.